Okay, so we are diving into this article today, Against the Liberal State of Mind. And honestly, the title alone, I got to say, it's a bit of a head turner. Like,
Okay.
at first glance, I thought it might be a bit much.
Yeah.
But then I got into it, I started reading, and it's actually really fascinating stuff.
It really is.
It's not just like a surface level thing. This is like really getting into how different political ideologies kind of view the world.
Yeah.
Especially kind of focusing on the whole left and right thing.
Absolutely. And I think what's really interesting is how the author uses history as a way to kind of unpack these differences.
Okay.
They've got this example about France
Okay.
that I think is really interesting,
Okay.
where they talk about how one view of history starts in 1789 with the French Revolution.
Right.
Like, that's the starting point.
Yeah.
It's a clean slate. Everything before that doesn't really matter.
Yeah, it's like the classic liberal perspective, right?
Yeah.
It's like everything before that is just like, well, it's just leading up to this moment.
Exactly.
Right.
And then they contrast that with this view, kind of more from the right, where the timeline goes way back.
Okay.
They're talking like ancient Gaul,
Oh, wow.
Roman Empire.
Oh.
Like, it's all connected.
So it's less about like a revolution and more about just this continuous flow.
Exactly.
Wow, okay.
It's less about a revolution, more about a continuous kind of thread through time.
So it's like you're watching two totally different movies.
Yes.
One is like all upheaval, and the other one is just like these long forces moving through time.
Yeah, and it's so interesting how this seemingly simple difference of where you start the clock shapes everything.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So for somebody who has that 1789 starting point, individual liberty might be the most important thing.
Right.
But for somebody looking at the longer timeline, it might be more about like social cohesion,
Right.
tradition.
Yeah.
And the author argues that this isn't just about France.
Yep.
This gets to the heart of how we in the West view the world.
See, that's where it starts getting really interesting to me, right?
Yeah.
Because then the author starts digging into liberalism's big claim,
Right.
which is that it's all about peace and progress.
Yeah.
But what they argue is that it's actually imposed a lot of times,
Oh, yeah.
and not always in the nicest ways, both within nations and globally.
And not always through like armies and tanks. Right.
Right.
The author's point is that there's a silencing of opposing views that happens within liberalism
Okay.
to the point where it becomes like the only acceptable way to think.
Okay, so like how does that actually work though? Like what does that look like in the real world?
Well, they talk about how private companies now have so much power
Yeah.
over information.
Right.
Think about social media platforms,
Right.
search engines.
Oh, yeah?
They can basically, deplatform people,
Right.
censor,
Yeah.
use algorithms to bury viewpoints that they don't like.
Right. So it's like they are doing the censorship for,
Yeah.
liberalism in a way.
But it's like outsourcing the censorship.
Right. Wow. Okay, so it's less about the government, locking people up for disagreeing, and more about just this like pressure
Right.
to conform or else you're, I don't know, ostracized.
Yeah.
Or maybe even worse. Who knows? Really?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And what I think is really fascinating is how the author then says that even within this seemingly dominant liberal system,
Right.
both traditional left and right factions, they kind of end up serving the same system.
Wait, hold on. So you're going to have to explain that way because how can they both be serving the same system when they're always fighting?
Right.
Like, give me an example.
Yeah. Well, think about campaign finance.
Oh, okay.
The author points out how both Democrats and Republicans, for
Yeah.
all their differences, they rely on these big money donations.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's not exactly a new thing.
Right.
Big money in politics.
Exactly.
It's almost like a cliche at this point.
But the author uses this to show how both sides, whether they realize it or not, they get kind of sucked into the system, right?
Okay.
Where they're beholden to these powerful interests. And it becomes less about like genuine ideological battles
Right.
and more about, how do we work within this system
Right.
that ultimately benefits us a lot of you.
Oh, okay. So it's like we're so busy watching the left and the right fight
Yes.
that we don't even notice that, like, the whole ring is tilted.
Exactly. And this leads into what I found to be, honestly, like one of the most challenging parts of the article,
Okay.
where they compare American liberalism to Soviet communism.
Whoa, okay, hold on. They're not saying those two things are the same, are they?
Not exactly.
Okay.
What they're saying is that both ideologies, even though they're presented as like total opposites,
Right.
they actually share this hostility towards certain kinds of traditional thinking.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The author then says they actually prefer Soviet-style traditionalism
Okay.
to what they call American degeneracy.
Okay, whoa. Hold on a second. Because those are some loaded terms right there.
Right, and we have to unpack that.
Yeah.
So when they talk about Soviet traditionalism, they're talking about things like social cohesion,
Okay.
national identity,
Right.
a strong centralized state.
Okay.
It's not about religious dogma or anything like that.
Right, so it's more about this kind of like shared sense of purpose,
Exactly.
identity within a society.
And then on the flip side, when they talk about American degeneracy, what they're talking about is like the breakdown of traditional values,
Right.
atomization of society,
Yeah.
this focus on like me, individualism above all else.
You know what's funny? This reminds me of these conversations I have with my grandparents sometimes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because they grew up in a time and place where like community was everything.
Right.
You know, everyone on the street knew each other. They all looked out for each other.
Yeah.
And they talk about now, like, especially in big cities, it can be kind of isolating,
Oh, interesting.
kind of lonely.
And that really gets at what the author's wrestling with, which is they're not like praising the Soviet Union, right?
Right. It's not about that. It's more about what have we lost?
Right.
What's been lost?
So it's less about communism is good, America is bad, and more about using that example to kind of be like, hey, is this like individualism thing?
Yes.
Maybe it's gone too far.
Exactly.
Okay, I see what they're saying.
And that then leads to the big question the author asks, which is, has the West, in its pursuit of like progress,
Yeah.
individual liberty, has it repressed its own rightist inclinations to the point of like self-hatred?
Ooh. Okay, so how do you even begin to answer that question?
Well, they argue that the West needs to find a way to integrate its past,
Okay.
even the parts that are uncomfortable,
Right.
into its present identity.
Okay.
They say we need a new kind of dialogue.
One that doesn't shy away from these challenging historical figures.
So instead of just trying to like erase it
Yes.
or condemn it, we need to actually understand it,
Exactly.
even if it's painful.
Learn from it.
Right.
And they actually point to modern Russia
Okay.
as an example where you have figures like Stalin and Solzhenitsyn.
Right.
They coexist in their national narrative. It's
Right.
it's a more nuanced,
Yeah.
more complex understanding of history.
It's funny because it seems like here in the West, certain figures, they're almost taboo.
Right.
It's like we can't even talk about them without being like, that's evil, we can't even discuss it.
And the author's point is that by doing that, by refusing to even engage, we might be doing ourselves a disservice.
Okay.
It's like we're denying this part of ourselves,
Right.
this part of our story.
Yeah.
And if we're not careful, that leads to a very skewed understanding of who we are
Right.
and where we come from.
I mean, how do we even have those conversations? Because when you start talking about like integrating figures like Hitler
Right.
into our understanding of history, I mean,
Yeah.
that's going to make a lot of people like really uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And the author is very clear that they are not condoning
Right.
the horrific actions
Right.
of those regimes. Right. It's more about how do we understand them
Right.
in context?
Yeah.
How do we, instead of treating them as like these anomalies,
Right.
grapple with how they emerged from and continue to influence, kind of the Western psyche?
So it's not about like glorifying the past, but it's
Yeah.
also not about pretending it didn't happen
Right.
and that it doesn't still shape who we are.
Exactly.
It's about acknowledging, the good and the bad,
Yeah,
the light and the shadow, and trying to learn from all of it.
exactly. And it's a challenging idea.
Right.
For sure. It
Mm.
requires a lot of nuance,
Right.
a lot of careful thought.
Yeah.
The author is not saying we need to agree with these historical figures
Right.
or their actions, but rather understanding them
Right.
is essential to understanding ourselves.
Yeah. It's like you can't just pick and choose the parts of history that you like. Right.
Right.
To really understand who we are, you got to look at the whole thing,
You got to look at the whole picture.
even the ugly parts.
And that takes us back to the author's point about seeing the world through just one lens.
Yeah.
Right. When we do that, we risk becoming blind to other perspectives,
Right.
other ways of understanding how things work.
Yeah.
And it makes it really hard to have, productive conversations about tough issues.
It's almost like we get stuck in an echo chamber.
Right.
We only hear what we want to hear.
Exactly.
Only see what we want to see. And that's, it's not good for anybody.
No, it limits our understanding.
Right.
It stifles our growth. It prevents us from truly engaging with the world,
Yeah.
with all of its complexity.
Wow. So, I mean, if we had to kind of boil it all down, what would you say is like the big takeaway
A big takeaway.
for our listener from this article?
I think it's this. The stories we tell ourselves about history, about progress, about right and wrong,
Right.
those stories, they matter. And it's so crucial to examine those stories, to question our assumptions, and to be open to different perspectives.
Because if we don't, we could end up with a very, very narrow view of the world.
Exactly.
And that's definitely not what the deep dive is all about. So with that, we encourage you, if any of this sparked your curiosity,
Please.
and I'm guessing it did, to check out the full article.
It's a challenging read,
Yeah.
but it's really rewarding, and it'll definitely give you a lot to think about.
A lot to think about.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.